The Newspaper Man Chapter 1, The Morning. He woke up every morning at precisely 6:30, though he never set an alarm. The clock on his nightstand blinked softly in the dim light, numbers shifting from 6:29 to 6:30 as if in quiet agreement with his internal rhythm. His eyes opened without urgency, staring at the ceiling for a moment before he shifted his legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cool under his feet, but not uncomfortably so, just enough to remind him of the day's beginning. He sat for a while on the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely on his knees, gazing at the small rug beside the dresser. There was no hurry, no list waiting to be checked off, no pressing appointments or obligations. Yet the routine remained unchanged. Slowly, he stood up, his joints creaking gently, the familiar soundtrack of his mornings. He walked across the room, opened the curtains a few inches, letting in a soft spill of morning light that colored the walls with a faint, pale warmth. He made his way to the bathroom. The faucet squeaked faintly as he turned it on, letting the water run until it reached the right temperature. He splashed his face, cupping his hands carefully under the stream, pressing the coolness against his skin. Looking into the mirror, he saw the same lines, the same silver strands at his temples, the same quiet eyes he'd known for decades. There was no rush to shave, that was reserved for Sundays. Today, like most days, he ran a comb through his hair, straightened the collar of his pajama shirt, and nodded softly to himself before turning off the light. The kitchen was quiet, just the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the space. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and leaned against the counter while he waited. The window over the sink overlooked the small backyard, where the grass had grown unevenly along the fence, and the single rose bush stood stubbornly in its corner. He watched a bird hop along the edge of the garden bed, pecking at invisible crumbs, its feathers ruffling slightly in the breeze. The kettle began to murmur, then whistle softly. He turned off the heat, poured the hot water over a waiting tea bag in his favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle, and let it steep while he prepared his toast. One slice of whole wheat, lightly buttered, no jam. The bread slid into the toaster with a quiet click, and he stood patiently, listening to the gentle ticking of the appliance as it warmed. When the toast popped up, he buttered it with deliberate, even strokes, then placed it on a small plate beside his tea. He carried the simple breakfast to the kitchen table, where a neatly folded napkin already waited. Sitting down, he sipped his tea slowly, eyes resting on the window, following the faint clouds drifting across the pale morning sky. Occasionally, he took a bite of toast, chewing thoughtfully, not hurried, not distracted. The clock on the wall ticked in steady rhythm, the only other sound in the room besides the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled into the day. He watched the minute hand move, quietly marking time, a gentle metronome to his morning ritual. When his tea was finished and the last crumbs brushed from the plate, he carried the dishes to the sink, rinsed them carefully, and set them on the drying rack. He wiped the counter, folded the napkin neatly, and placed it back in the drawer. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. He walked to the bedroom again, changed from his pajama shirt into a button-down, beige today, with the faintest pattern of thin lines that crossed like invisible grids. He buttoned it slowly, methodically, smoothing the fabric as he went. He stepped into his slacks, adjusted the waistband, and buckled his belt with quiet precision. In the hallway, he reached for his jacket, the one he always wore, its cuffs slightly worn but still sturdy, the fabric soft from years of wear. He checked the pockets by habit, confirming the presence of his wallet, his handkerchief, and the small change he kept for the newspaper. At the door, he paused. He looked at the key hook, touched the set of keys that hung there, though he wouldn't need them just yet. He opened the door slowly, stepping out into the gentle morning air. It was cool but not cold, the kind of weather that made the skin feel awake. The street was quiet, save for the distant sound of a car starting somewhere down the block. He locked the door behind him, placed the keys in his pocket, and began his walk. The sidewalk felt familiar under his feet, each crack and line a map he had walked countless times. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the front yards, illuminating the dew that clung to the grass. He passed the same houses, each one as it had been yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. The white house with the blue shutters. The yellow house with the porch swing that never moved. The brick house with the garden gnome standing guard by the mailbox. At the corner, he nodded politely to Mrs. Fletcher, who was out watering her geraniums. She raised her hand in quiet greeting, her watering can tilting gently, droplets falling like soft applause onto the soil. Neither spoke. Words weren't needed in these early hours. He continued, the rhythm of his step steady, unchanging. Past the small bakery with its closed sign still hanging in the window, the faint scent of bread lingering in the air. Past the old bookstore with its faded awning and display of yellowing paperbacks. Past the vacant lot where once there had been a playground, now overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers. He crossed the street carefully, pausing to look both ways even though no cars approached. At the kiosk, he waited patiently behind a man buying cigarettes, his hands folded calmly in front of him. When it was his turn, he stepped forward. 3, please, he said, his voice low but clear. The vendor smiled, already reaching for the stack of newspapers. Same as always. He nodded. Same as always. She handed him 3 identical copies, their folded edges crisp, the ink faintly fragrant. He paid with exact change, thanked her softly, and tucked the papers under his arm. He turned toward home, retracing his steps, each one deliberate, familiar, measured. The houses stood quietly in their places. The gnome still stood by the mailbox. The porch swing remained still. As he reached his front gate, he paused again, looking briefly at the sky, noting the way the clouds had shifted, stretched thin like threads across the pale blue canvas. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind him. The house settled around him again, embracing him in its quiet familiarity. He placed the newspapers carefully on the table, aligned their edges, and removed his jacket, hanging it neatly by the door. He stood for a moment, looking at the papers, then at the window, then back at the papers again. The day, like every day, had begun. Chapter 2: The Walk to the Kiosk. He stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him, the soft click of the latch marking the beginning of his daily journey. The morning air felt cool on his skin, a mild breeze brushing gently against his face as he adjusted his jacket and placed his hands in his pockets. The street stretched ahead, empty except for a cat sitting lazily near a gate, its eyes half closed, tail curling around its body. The cat watched him for a moment, then turned away, uninterested. He began walking at his usual pace, steady, deliberate, unhurried. Each step landed with familiar weight on the pavement, the soles of his shoes tapping out a quiet, regular rhythm. He passed the same houses he always passed, the white one with the blue shutters, the yellow one with the overgrown rose bushes, the brick one with the cracked sidewalk. Nothing had changed, and he liked it that way. At the corner, Mrs. Fletcher stood with her garden hose, watering her geraniums. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face, and as he approached, she raised one hand in a small wave without pausing her watering. He nodded politely in return. They never exchanged words in the morning. The routine was enough, a silent acknowledgement of each other's presence. The sidewalk curved gently past the old bakery, its windows still dark, a faint scent of flour and yeast lingering in the air even though the ovens hadn't been lit yet. A delivery truck was parked outside, the driver leaning against the door, sipping from a thermos. He nodded to the man as he passed, receiving a quiet nod back, nothing more. Further down, he walked by the little park with its empty benches and swings hanging still. A pair of pigeons pecked at crumbs near the sandbox, fluttering away as he approached, only to return once he'd passed. The leaves on the trees stirred lightly in the breeze, casting shifting shadows on the path. He paused briefly at the pedestrian crossing, though no cars approached, looking both ways out of habit before stepping across. The kiosk came into view, a small structure with a faded awning, stacked crates of bottled water, and rows of colorful magazines lined up behind glass. The vendor was already arranging the day's papers, straightening them with careful hands, brushing invisible specks of dust from their covers. When he reached the kiosk, he waited quietly as the vendor completed her task. She turned to him with a smile, already knowing his request. "3, as usual?" she asked. He nodded, his lips curving into a small, polite smile. "Yes. 3, please." She handed him the newspapers, freshly folded, their ink still carrying the faint warmth of the press. He gave her the exact change, placing the coins carefully in her waiting palm. "Have a good day," she said, her voice light and routine. "You too," he replied softly. He tucked the newspapers under his arm, adjusted his jacket, and turned to begin the walk back home, retracing the same path, passing the same houses, the same trees, the same empty playground. The world around him moved gently, without hurry, each detail familiar, each moment like the echo of 1,000 mornings before. And as he walked, the sound of his footsteps blended quietly with the breeze, the distant hum of traffic, and the soft calls of birds overhead, all folding into the steady rhythm of a day unfolding exactly as it always had. Chapter 3: Returning Home and Preparing. He stepped through the front gate, pausing for a moment to glance at the sky. The clouds had shifted since his walk began, drifting lazily toward the horizon, thinning into faint streaks of white against the growing blue. He stood quietly, his gaze following their slow movement, before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The house welcomed him with its familiar silence. He set the newspapers carefully on the kitchen table, aligning their edges until they formed a neat, perfect stack. His jacket came off next, hung precisely on the wooden hook by the door, the sleeves smoothed down with the palm of his hand. He took a moment to check his pockets, ensuring nothing remained inside, before giving the jacket one last small pat and turning toward the kitchen. He filled the kettle again, setting it on the stove just as he had that morning. The flame flickered beneath the metal, soft and steady. While the water heated, He wiped down the counter with a damp cloth, running the fabric in long, even lines, collecting invisible specks of dust. He straightened the salt and pepper shakers, adjusted the placement of the small vase holding a single artificial daisy, and pressed lightly on the tablecloth to smooth its edges. The kettle began its low hum. He prepared a fresh tea bag in his mug, the same chipped one, the same quiet ritual. When the water reached a gentle boil, he poured it over the bag, letting the steam curl upward in soft ribbons before settling at the rim. He watched it steep, the color blooming slowly into amber warmth. He carried the mug to the living room, setting it down on a small coaster beside his favorite chair. The chair faced the window, where the sunlight now streamed in wider beams, casting rectangles of light onto the carpet. He sat down carefully, easing into the cushions, adjusting himself until he felt centered. His hands rested on the armrests, fingers curling lightly around the worn fabric. He sat like that for a while, simply looking out the window. The street was still quiet. A bird fluttered to the fence, paused, then flew off again. A leaf drifted down from the tall tree across the way, landing softly on the sidewalk. Nothing urgent called for his attention, nothing demanded his time. Eventually, he reached for the newspapers. He carried them back to the kitchen table, placing them down with the same precision as before. He unfolded the first one carefully, spreading it flat, smoothing the creases along its edges. His eyes moved slowly over the headlines, reading each letter with quiet focus. He didn't rush, didn't skim. He allowed the words to unfold at their own pace. When he finished the front page, he folded the paper again, pressing it neatly back into its original shape. He set it aside, reached for the second, and repeated the process, unfolding, smoothing, reading, folding. The third followed, no different, no deviation. Each movement deliberate, familiar, practiced. He placed the 3 folded newspapers in a new stack beside the others, aligning the corners until they matched perfectly. He stood back, hands resting lightly on the table's edge, surveying the neatness of the arrangement. The stack from today joined the many before it, each day marked by 3 quiet pages. Satisfied, he picked up his mug again, returning to his chair by the window. The tea had cooled just enough to sip comfortably. He took a slow drink, holding the warmth in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, eyes still resting on the simple scene outside. The afternoon light shifted gradually, softening as it passed through the glass, casting faint patterns across the floor. He traced the patterns absently with his gaze, letting them drift and change. Another sip of tea, another quiet moment. The clock ticked steadily from the wall, each second passing without urgency, without demand. He sat with it, letting the minutes gather around him, wrapping him in their gentle repetition. The day moved forward, not quickly, not slowly, but exactly as it should. And as he finished his tea, setting the mug back onto the coaster, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a routine completed, of simple tasks fulfilled, of another morning and afternoon folded neatly into place. Chapter 4: Reading the Newspapers. He sat back down at the table, the newspapers waiting in a neat pile before him. The afternoon light filtered softly through the curtains, stretching across the table in pale stripes. He reached for the first paper, lifting it gently, unfolding it with slow, careful hands. The rustle of the pages was quiet, almost comforting, a familiar sound that filled the stillness of the room. He smoothed the paper flat, running his palm along the creases until it lay evenly before him. His eyes traced the headlines, moving from left to right, taking in each word with quiet patience. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no need to rush through the stories. The front page held the important pieces, the summaries of the world beyond his window, and that was enough. He read each headline twice, sometimes 3 times, as if ensuring the words stayed with him. Occasionally, he would pause, tilting his head slightly, considering a phrase or a name, letting it linger in his thoughts before moving on. His lips moved silently, shaping the words without speaking them aloud, a private ritual of attention. When he finished reading the front page, he folded the newspaper carefully along its original lines, pressing each crease with deliberate fingers. He set it aside, aligning it perfectly on the growing pile, and reached for the second. The process repeated itself, unfolding, smoothing, reading, folding, each movement quiet and precise, like steps in a well-rehearsed dance. The second front page offered similar news, variations of stories he had already seen, different angles on the same events. Still, he read it fully, eyes moving steadily across the print, giving each headline its due. There was a comfort in the repetition, a reassurance in seeing the same world from multiple perspectives, even if the words didn't change much. He folded the second paper just as carefully as the first, aligning its edges, pressing its folds. It joined the first on the stack, their corners matching exactly. He paused for a moment, hands resting lightly on the tabletop, his gaze lingering on the neat pile before reaching for the third. The third unfolded with the same soft rustle, the paper bending willingly beneath his fingers. He smoothed it flat, eyes settling once again on the headlines. This front page, too, carried the same stories, the same familiar names and places. Yet he read it with the same attention, the same slow, measured care. As he finished the last headline, he folded the paper carefully, pressing the edges, smoothing the creases until it looked just as it had before. He placed it atop the others, completing the day's ritual. The 3 papers lay stacked neatly, aligned like a quiet monument to another day observed, another set of stories acknowledged. He sat back, hands resting on his lap, eyes drifting to the window once more. Outside, the shadows had shifted, stretching longer across the yard, the sun lowering itself behind the neighboring rooftops. A bird landed on the fence, fluffed its feathers, and hopped along the wooden rail before flying away again. The house was quiet, save for the soft tick of the clock on the wall. He listened to it for a while, letting its steady rhythm settle around him, marking the afternoon's gentle slide into evening. He stood, picking up the stack of newspapers with both hands, and carried them carefully to the growing pile on the side table. He placed them atop the others, adjusting the corners, pressing lightly to ensure the stack remained stable. Then he stepped back, looking at it thoughtfully, as if checking a small piece of the world he could keep in order. Satisfied, he turned back toward the kitchen, washed his hands at the sink, and dried them on the towel that hung beside the stove. The kettle remained on the counter, waiting to be filled again for the evening. He glanced at it, then at the window, noting the last slivers of sunlight fading from the sky. He folded the towel neatly over its rack, straightened the salt and pepper shakers once more, and gave the tablecloth a final smoothing touch. The room settled with him, the quiet familiar and steady, the newspapers resting where they belonged, their stories folded neatly into place. Chapter 5: The Stack of Newspapers and Memories. The stack of newspapers sat quietly by the wall, a solid column of folded pages rising nearly to the height of the windowsill. He looked at it as he passed, his gaze lingering for a few seconds before moving on. It wasn't an obstruction, it wasn't in the way. It had grown there, slowly, steadily, each day adding 3 more layers, each day building on the last. Some of the edges were slightly worn, the corners softened from time and gravity, but the stack held firm, balanced, unwavering. He had started placing them there years ago, though he couldn't have said exactly when. At first, it was convenience, no need to throw them away immediately, no urgency to clear them out. Then, as weeks passed, the stack became something more, though he wouldn't have called it a collection. It wasn't about keeping the news, or saving headlines, or preserving stories. It was simply what he did. He read the front pages, folded them, placed them on the stack. And so it grew. He would sometimes run his hand lightly along the side of the pile, feeling the texture of the papers beneath his fingertips. It was a familiar sensation, soft and rough at once, a kind of quiet companionship in the room. Visitors had asked, on rare occasions, why he kept them all. "Are you planning to recycle them?" someone had once suggested. He had only smiled politely, offering no explanation. The stack stood through seasons. In summer, when the sun beamed through the window and lit the dust motes swirling in the air, it cast a soft shadow across the floor. In winter, when the glass fogged slightly from the difference in temperature, the stack seemed to lean closer to the radiator, absorbing the gentle warmth. It was never moved, never rearranged. Only added to, day by day, paper by paper. He could see the subtle lines where each day's edition began, a faint variation in the color of the paper, the tiniest shifts in alignment. He sometimes noticed a headline peeking out from the side, a bold word or a partial phrase. But he never unfolded them again, never revisited what had already been read. The stories belonged to the day they were printed. The pages belonged to the pile. Once, when his niece had come to visit, she had gestured toward the stack with a curious look. "What's with all the newspapers, Uncle?" she'd asked. He'd shrugged gently. "Just keeping them," he'd replied, offering no further details. She had laughed lightly, not unkindly, and left it at that. It wasn't the kind of question that needed an answer. He dusted the top of the stack now and then, careful not to disturb the balance. He didn't count the papers. He didn't mark the passing of time by their number. But he knew they marked time all the same. Each one was a day. Each one was a morning, a walk to the kiosk, a moment at the kitchen table. The stack wasn't a record of events. It was a quiet measure of the routine itself. There were days he wondered how tall it might grow. Whether it would one day reach the window's edge. Whether it might someday lean, finally, too far to one side, and topple in a soft, rustling collapse. But it never did. It remained steady, uncomplaining, accepting each new addition without question. He liked the way it stood there. Solid. Predictable. Present. Like the chair by the window, or the kettle on the stove, or the familiar creak in the floorboard near the pantry. It was simply part of the house now, part of the quiet rhythm that shaped his days. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, when the sun dipped low and the room filled with a golden kind of stillness, he would glance at the stack and feel an odd sense of peace. It wasn't pride, and it wasn't nostalgia. It was something softer, something quieter, like the satisfaction of a shelf well organized, or a garden bed weeded clean. The papers didn't demand attention. They simply were. And he let them be. And so, each day, after reading the 3 front pages, after folding them carefully and aligning their edges, he placed them atop the growing stack, pressed them gently into place, and stepped back, watching for a moment as if confirming that all was as it should be. Then he turned away, the task complete, the day folded neatly alongside the many before it. The Newspaper Man, Chapter 6, The Visit from His Grandson. One afternoon, as the light stretched long across the carpet and the clock ticked its steady rhythm, a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't unexpected, yet it wasn't part of his usual routine. He stood, smoothing his shirt, and walked to the door, opening it with a quiet creak. "Hi, Grandpa," his grandson said, smiling warmly. A young man now, taller than he remembered, with an easy grin and bright eyes. "Thought I'd stop by. Hope that's okay." He stepped aside, gesturing his grandson in. "Of course. Come in." The young man glanced around the familiar space as he entered, his gaze lingering briefly on the tall stack of newspapers by the wall. "You've been busy," he joked lightly, nodding toward it. He offered a soft smile in return. "They pile up." His grandson sat down at the kitchen table, resting his arms casually on the surface. I always wondered, he began, why 3 newspapers every day? I mean, he hesitated, looking toward the stack again. You only read the first page, right? Mom said you always do that. He poured a glass of water, placing it gently on the table in front of his grandson, then took a seat across from him. His hands rested quietly on the table's edge, fingers lightly curled. Yes, he said simply. Just the first page. His grandson leaned forward, his voice curious but gentle. But why 3? Why not 1? Why not read more? Doesn't it seem, I don't know, unnecessary? He gazed down at his hands for a moment, then lifted his eyes to meet his grandson's. There was no rush in his answer, no impatience, only a calm quiet that seemed to belong to the rhythm of the room. It's just what I do, he said softly. Every morning. 3 newspapers. First page of each. His grandson smiled again, a small, thoughtful expression. You've always done it. Yes, he replied. Always. The young man's gaze moved again to the tall stack. Do you ever read them again? Or are they just there? They're just there, he said. I don't need to read them again. His grandson nodded slowly, as if absorbing something he couldn't quite explain, then leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms lightly. Well, he said with a chuckle, it's kind of nice. I mean, it's consistent. He smiled again, a little wider this time. Yes. Consistent. They sat together for a while longer, sipping water, watching the afternoon light shift across the floor. No hurry, no agenda. Just the quiet presence of 2 people, sharing a space shaped by years of familiar patterns. Outside, a bird landed on the fence, fluffed its wings, then flew away again. Chapter 7: The Explanation. Later, as the afternoon slipped gently into early evening, his grandson stood by the stack of newspapers, one hand resting lightly on the top. He looked over his shoulder, curiosity still flickering in his expression. "Grandpa," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from his chair by the window, his hands folded loosely in his lap. Of course. His grandson turned fully, facing him with a quiet seriousness. Why 3? He asked again, his voice calm, sincere. Why have you always bought 3 newspapers? He paused for a moment, gazing out the window at the fading sky. The light was soft now, the last rays painting pale streaks across the rooftops. Then he looked back at his grandson, his expression gentle, unhurried. "Because that's what my father did," he said, his voice steady, low. "He always bought 3. Every day. I never asked him why. I just watched him do it. And when I was old enough, I started doing the same." His grandson tilted his head slightly, a small smile growing at the corner of his mouth. "And you never found out why he did?" "No," he replied quietly. "I never needed to. It wasn't something I felt needed changing." He offered a faint smile of his own, one filled with quiet acceptance. "Not everything needs to be different." His grandson stepped closer, his hand still resting on the stack. "I like that," he said softly. The old man nodded once, slow and thoughtful, then turned his gaze back to the window, watching as the last bird of the evening soared across the sky, its wings stretched wide against the dimming light. The house settled around them, the clock ticking gently in the background, the newspapers resting in their familiar place. And in that moment, everything felt as it should be. Thank you for listening. I wish you a peaceful, restful night.